I'm going to be a software salesman here, I think. You're going to get some of my pitch. I was at the first meeting, this first CMB meeting, and I'm glad there have been more because I think the thing I asked Jonathan the audience not to quote was we invited the media, and the best headline I could think of was climate bill fails, environmentalists decide the human brain needs to be rewired to fix climate change. So I'm glad, and it may be true by the way, so I'm glad we're still working on it and we haven't had that headline yet. Right at the time I came to the last, and I want to say just one thing about the prior presentation, which is the two big drivers of the consumer society that you highlighted, mortgages and freeways were both explicitly racist policies of the United States government. You weren't allowed to lend money that would make a community heterogeneous. You had to lend in ways that kept it homogeneous. That was in the regulation, which meant you couldn't lend to black people. So black people couldn't get mortgages till the Civil Rights Act passed in 1965. And freeways were explicitly targeted for neighborhoods that were black or people of color communities. Just as there are diverse cultures all over the world, there are diverse cultures of consumerism in the United States. And I wrote a piece with Gerald and a couple other people called The Soul of Environmentalism, sort of in response to the death of environmentalism. And the easy thing was, let's remember black people and people of color and Latinos and Native Americans and think about environmentalism. One of the reasons environmental justice thinking and thinking about diversity in the environmental movement is so important is because those of us with the least power are often the canaries in the coal mine, as was discussed earlier. So what happened in the last recession and what happened in the Great Depression were easily foreshadowed by looking at what happened to people of color, voyage through poverty, voyage through consumerism, prior to the Great Recession. And so you can learn lessons about resilience and what happens as a result of these things. And that's also true in environmental work more broadly. So I left direct climate policy activism right around the time I came to the last CMB on the theory that, because I'd worked a lot on the climate legislation at the state level before that, and we'd had quite a bit of success right about then. And I said, well, Americans change the world in two ways. They vote and they shop. And I'd worked on the policy stuff, which is the expression of their voting, for a long time. And I figured, let me go work on their shopping. Also because I'm convinced that consumerism is a very important factor in any kind of change. So I figured, let me go actually get into it and learn about it. So what I wanted to do today was talk to you about what I've learned in the last 6 or 7 years in clean tech, which is where I've been. And I've specifically been in clean tech software, but been advising companies that do hardware and make products as well. And why I haven't quite found the answer that I'd hoped would be there, that I think many of us have. There's this idea that, certainly my favorite proponent of it is Amory Lovins, right? That there's all this, low-hanging fruit is what we call it, or fruit on the floor, and and I'm sure we've all been in the talks where it's just obvious that there's all this energy savings just sitting out there, and we just have to kind of show people, and they're going to pick it up and run with it. And one of the things I've learned in business is why that's not happening, and why it may take longer than we'd like. And I don't have a lot of good answers, although I'll come back to some of the ones that Maury raised at the end of his talk. So I'm really interested in enrolling you and helping me to think about this and what answers there might be to make this stuff that we think is supposed to work actually work. First, I thought I would talk about my theory of change. I actually think there's a huge cadre of activists who understand what I'm expressing in this slide here, which is although we don't know exactly how to solve global warming politically and socially and culturally, there's a few baseline things that have to happen for us to solve them, and there's a huge amount of activists in the commercial sector. Because without any doubt, at a political level, the fossil fuel industry has a political chokehold on our world and our cultures. And they're the fat guy sitting at the top of or the big guy sitting at the top of the seesaw. And I think the most likely political pattern that my experience tells me about is that those of us who are fighting to dethrone that power or to kill it, or whatever you want to call it, because they're not going to go gentle into that good night. They make a lot of money with those singing dinosaurs, those mermaids under the ground that make a lot of money when you pump them out, is we're going to run up that seesaw a number of times. We just tried with Waxman-Markey. We've been successful some in states until we finally tipped them over. I'm not a huge tipping point guy, but this is sort of a tipping point issue, right? Which is, there's going to be 3, 4, 5 runs, 4 or 5 more Waxman-Markey battles before we actually have enough power. And that is to say the economic forces that would replace them, the business forces that would replace the fossil fuel sector, to actually get rid of the incredibly large political and economic advantages that they enjoy, including, for example, fighting a $3 trillion war in Iraq to protect our oil supply. So it's a very, very big political issue, and you have to have a meaningful business sector that represents meaningful, powerful economic interests that are willing to, that have the power and the ability to drive a stake through the heart of the fossil fuel industry all over the world. So that's the theory, and a ton of people I know who are doing this. I'm thinking of Amy Christensen, P.J. Simmons, sort of all of us who've done climate activism who are kind of now in the business sector. We sort of all, this is one of our motivators right here, is there has to be a meaningful, politically powerful business sector. The second theory of change is, and Maggie Fox at Reality Project would sort of says the same thing in a slightly different way, is we have to have a credible, we actually have to be believable that we can replace this stuff called fossil fuel. People actually have to believe it, right? It's a little bit like if I said to you all, I've just figured out that we really don't need air anymore. We can all live on water, right? Maggie Fox says that fossil fuels are mother, right? And you'd be like, Michael's really smart. He's probably right. But unless like 10 or 15% of us in this room right here were actually using water instead of air, it'd be really hard to convince anybody that this could actually happen, right? And that's another dimension, is we have to have enough of a sector of usage, of people, of practice in place for people to credibly think we could get off this stuff. We could actually give it up. We could leave it in the ground, right? Because we have to not use, this is pre-fracking, we have to not use 70% of proven reserves of fossil fuel. We have to take something like 600, I think it's like $600 trillion. It's a lot of value. Because the energy industry is $7 trillion a year. We have to take like $600 trillion of embedded, owned, on the books value out of fossil fuel companies when we leave that stuff in the ground. We're going to take it away from them by saying we're not going to use it. So those are the two dimensions of the theories of change, at least the people I know who are working on in the business sector think about. So here's the theory, right? Here's what's wrong. I'm going to use a couple different lenses. Here's energy efficiency, why we use too much energy. This is a slide I borrowed from Jim Sweeney, Stanford University, great thinker on energy efficiency. These are the barriers, market failures, behavioral issues to why all that low-hanging fruit's not getting used, right? And those of us in information technology are encouraged by the fact that about 80% of those things have to do with information. And so with this incredible information revolution we're under, the blue boxes show them, well, that's it, it's solved. iPhones and sensors and internet, and that's it. We've solved 80% of the barriers to why we don't have more energy efficiency. What's the problem? Here we go. And and certainly Jim Sweeney feels this way. I mean, we're all kind of like, well, gosh, we now have great information technology. We've solved the problem. And a lot of us, and it's extending a little bit, I'd say, the illusion we have that we are going to be able to jump through this one really fast. And I'll give you 2 examples of how I've tried to jump through that and 2 companies I've helped build. My first company was called Cooler. It's still in existence. We still have an iPhone app, though sometimes it doesn't work, but we do other stuff with eBay and GSA. And this is, you can take a picture of a barcode with this app, and we'll tell you what the carbon footprint of any product in the US market is, just based on the barcode, instantly. And we'll tell you how much it is. We'll give you, if you click on that arrow, we tell you how many car trips it is, airplane flights. We help you buy it in a way that's carbon neutral. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But we genuinely do it in a very high integrity way. We'll neutralize the carbon impact of that. We'll do the equivalent of sucking the same amount of CO2 that it took to make it out of the atmosphere somewhere on the planet. You can buy and offset directly. And we'll give you ideas for what to do instead of buying that thing, or how to reduce the impact of that purchase. And then we'll let you share it socially. This was a really fun idea before the recession, and we were doing really well. Then banks were going to put it on banking statements, and all your spending would be tracked, and then we'd remind you at Easter that last Easter you had a bigger carbon footprint and you could do things about it. And then we had a Great Recession and the banks. And we were trying to make carbon a currency in shopping, just like S&H green stamps were a currency once, or frequent flyer miles. And in a great and deep recession, there are no other currencies besides cash or discounts. And carbon has lost its currency for consumers pretty much almost totally in the marketplace. There's no interest to speak of anywhere in the world. And I have friends trying to do stuff like this elsewhere and stuff like that. But we still have the technology to put a carbon footprint on anything, anywhere. So if you have any ideas as to how I can make money with that, let me know. So this is the third company I built, which is called buildingenergy.com. We're trying to solve the problem of energy data because it's hard to get. So if you're trying to fix a building, you might hire somebody to sell you something, and they may collect a lot of data about the energy use in your building. And then that person might be selling you Windows, and someone else might want to sell you software. And the guy who sold you the Windows or person who sold you the Windows isn't going to share the data with the person who wants to sell you the software, because they are not making enough money selling you the Windows, so the data is an important part of what they think they're getting the value of. And the utility won't share it. It'll be hard to get. So getting energy data, as many of you probably know, is still very, very hard. We are in the midst of an explosion in the availability of that data, smart meters and building sensors and incredible technology that blow your socks off, and you think, okay, that's it, problem solved. There are, at $1.25 a square foot, you can put a sensor in every socket in this building that would tell you what the foot traffic was, the temperature and ambient lighting, and also control that socket to optimally use the energy in the light bulb and in the socket down there. It's incredibly cheap to do incredibly big data, wild things with buildings, and yet nobody's doing them at scale yet or anything else. But in any case, so we tried to solve, I was in a company before that tried to solve the whole picture, and it's still going but not making any money. That was a Kleiner Perkins company, like a big VC thing. This was a moderate VC thing, and what we're doing here is, this is something called the DOE Buildings Performance Database. That this year we'll have 500,000 buildings of real energy use, at least 1 year of monthly, if not more, fine-grained energy use, and asset data. So this is like much better than Energy Star, right? We're going to know how many air conditioners they have, what the types of walls there are, and there's incredible hope here because cities around the country and around the world are mandating reporting of this data in terms of audits, annual or audits of large commercial buildings. There's a huge flow of information coming out of the building sector in cities that are regulating energy. And the software we built is the repository for that information in the United States. And so this is quite a dynamic little tool. That actually represents, as you can see, currently 63,000 buildings. It'll be 500,000 real buildings in the United States. And you'll be able to use those filters on the left to see, well, how does a CFL building perform versus a T8 or a T12 building versus a building? And how does a CFL perform when the building has south-facing windows and north-facing windows? It's incredibly rich. And we can plot those dots super fast. And then we can even, this was one of our customers, we can even plot your stores or your buildings against all the other 500,000 buildings, or the 30,000 that are exactly like you. So you can look at your peers dynamically and understand what it is. And most importantly, we're creating a data platform that's completely application neutral, so that the Windows vendor can come in and test their proposition to you against your data, because it's now available. We're putting it up in the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. Sounds like a really good idea, right? Really cool. And the owners will own their data, and they can get it out, and all that kind of wonderful stuff. And nobody wants to buy this at all. So there's hope. There's incredibly, this is like, if I was sitting back at a policy group, I'd be like, that's it, it's done, we have the technology, why isn't this happening, right? So here's a little bit, here's kind of what's been going on with software and how software has changed large commercial practices in the last 25 years. There are 5 sectors: finance, sales, product, supply chain, and human resources, that are software practices that are between $10 and $30 billion a year. People who sell software, energy technology in those sectors, in each of those sectors, are making between $10 and $30 billion a year. And they have revolutionized. Those of us who don't work in big organizations may not have run across it, but you're experiencing it at the checkout point at a Walmart. My favorite story is a company that manages human capital. Saba Systems. 4 years into their existence, they started. 4 years later, they were covering 198 million employees in over 100 countries. And they were the company you'd go to if you wanted to be sure that everybody who worked for you had had sexual harassment training. You're a big company, you want to figure that out, right? You want to know because you might get sued. And then you can deliver the sexual harassment training in an audible way, in person, online, on a phone. And think about somebody like Nestle that might want to build 30 dairies in Indonesia. How did they know before this software existed who knew how to build dairies in Indonesia for them, right? It's incredibly valuable. Right? It's revolutionary to know what everybody in your global organization knows, what you've taught them, what you've trained them to do. And so in 4 years, they had 198 million employees in this piece of software. It's incredible. So we don't run across this stuff in our day-to-day lives as consumers. Facebook is, in fact, competing with these things. There's all kinds of other market dynamics that are really interesting. But the thing about these 5 areas is that they are business practices that are thousands of years old. Jewelry salespeople in ancient Rome knew that when the crop came in, you could sell the farmer's wife a new ring. There was a pattern, right? The quartermaster general of the Roman army knew that if he could figure out, he even probably knew the formula for if he could figure out how many steaks are being eaten at the German front, how many less cattle he had to buy 3 months later. But he couldn't get that information back in 2000 BC or whenever it was. But people have known this stuff for a long time, that there were patterns that we needed to accelerate and change that could make a huge difference. And so when software came along, right, it sort of happened. Supply chain, it took like 4 years. There was a bunch of supply chain software companies that just were sort of making the data easier. And then finally one of them went, wait, aren't we supposed to actually save our customers money, not just let them know where everything is? And they optimized supply chains. Energy is not like this. Energy is not a business process. This is just sort of, it intersects all these areas, but it's not a business process that is thousands of years old. We don't know how many bales of hay it took to move a keg of beer across London in 1872. We just don't know that. We know how many horses the stable had. We know how much hay they used. We know how many people they hired. But we didn't know the relationship between the energy input, the hay and the horses, and the commercial output, which was the moving of beer. And I suspect, I haven't given this that much thought, that energy is in many ways still pre-economic. As much as it's marketized in a variety of ways, it is not economic in the way these 5 other sectors are. It's not financialized in the way these 5 other sectors are. That's sort of a nascent theory I have. But, so that's what I mean by making the road by walking it. You actually can't sell a lot of stuff unless the road is already built. So we can't deploy this incredible technology super fast into a business process that's not at least 30 years old, let alone thousands of years old, as is finance, supply chain, HR, product management, et cetera. These are old things that are happening on the left. They've happened for a long time, and they've been revolutionized by software. The revolution's just begun, but they have already been revolutionized. So let me give you an example of supply chain. And look at how software has, and by the way, the person running Apple is the guy who ran supply for Apple, right? How does Apple use supply chain information and software? They monopolize holiday shippers. They lock up key materials like Gorilla Glass and lasers to etch chips and materials. They make capital investment. They buy firms, not just in the United States, that have promising technology that's going to feed into making the iPhone or whatever else they want to make. At the core of their business, they do the 3 supply is critical to revenue, risk mitigation, and cost, the 3 big drivers of any big company. There's reason there's an iPhone 4 and a 4S and a 5. It helps them compete against all the other types of smartphones that are out there. They are able to do very tight control and secrecy over their product visibility, as we know about Apple. They're able to control costs well into the future through exclusive supply deals. And then on the customer side, and this is just supply chain software, affecting every dimension of the business, before the business, the core of the business, and the way they face their consumers. There are just enough iPhones the day it's released that people aren't frustrated, but they still stand in line, right? No riots, maybe in a few places, but, right? And so that's a supply chain issue. They have exclusivity with their partners. They figure out which models they can sell to who, and they have investor confidence because there's enough supply. And this is just supply chain software. Think about how critical supply chain software is to Apple. What would that look like in the energy sector? I have an idea. Tried to sell it a number of times. there's lots, you could create a business process around energy that would be similar. At the front of the company, where are they buying their energy? At the core of the company, risk mitigation, cost reduction, revenue, the revenue you get from being super green, all the reasons we sell. And then, of course, renegotiating a relationship with vendors, which a lot of people are doing down the supply chain. Walmart, others are already telling their vendors how much energy they're allowed to use while they make their stuff and things like that. Great stuff is happening, but it's not a system, right? It's not so clearly and crisply defined as, for example, supply chain innovation is today, and it may still be a while. It's happening, but it still may take us a lot longer. So when we say, oh, we're revolutionizing the way buildings audit themselves or things like that, there's system issues with how do people make decisions fast, how do you scale in these powerful economies we're in that really are going to slow us down, unfortunately. And the second big thing I would say is this immaturity makes it hard for buyers on the behavioral level to make a choice. All right, I was toying with the idea of jacking up Jonathan here and saying, Jonathan, I'm going to come to you with one of your buildings, and I'm going to say, I could sell you great new windows, or I could sell you amazing software that cost about the same to save you energy. Do any of you know how to make that decision? I'm in the field. I don't know how to make that decision. You could probably save just as much energy with some windows I'd sell you as some great software I'd sell you. But it's like, oh, OK, which one do I do, right? That's not true in other commercial sectors. There are much clearer defined terms of decision making and purchasing that allow the equivalent to happen much more quickly. Right? The road is built. People know how to make a choice between different options for the same outcome in a much more mature way in other commercial sectors, finance, product, et cetera, than they do in energy. There's still a huge amount of just kind of like paralysis because the decision, it's not been core enough to the business that the decision makers have had to understand the landscape and be able to make choices quickly because it's something they have to do day in and day out. And absent that day in and day out relationship, you can't sell them a lot of shit. You can't change what they do very quickly. It's going to happen, but this is sort of the problem. And this is true in hardware too, right? I mean, the biggest solar producer in China just went bankrupt because they couldn't quite figure out like what was going on, right? Even though solar's booming, all right? So, here's the example, like First Fuel, this wonderful company versus Windows. All right, so there are many behavioral challenges and many things that energy software and energy technology could help us with, and this is sort of a map of them. You can take a look at. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there are lots of dimensions to the energy challenge out there. Let me show you a little bit. I wanted to get a little concrete about what would it look like if the road was built. You'd be changing people's lives. For example, you would change a CFO's life. Before a system was in place, there were no controls over energy costs. This is this condition today for most CFOs at companies. They don't care. It's not enough of their spend, so there's no or low granularity for financial models. They don't have any modeling for this key component of their costs. They're just kind of paying the bills, right? And they have no visibility on supply, on conservation, or renewables. They have no ability to kind of understand the inflow of rebates or subsidies or anything. There's no modeling. There's no predictability. And all of you know that CFOs like that, right? And it's essential to building a fast and big business. If, on the other hand, you did have a business process, then you would, in fact, potentially have full visibility on energy exposure. You'd be able to model your dependencies, how much of what you sold, how much stuff you could make out of how much energy, for example, on a regular basis, and what the dependencies were. And you'd have a very big, full suite of options, of choices, of variables that you could tweak to change your energy spend and your energy consumption. For the facilities manager, beforehand, today there's disparate control and accountability processes. Each building is managed differently. Each facilities manager is held accountable for their energy use differently. There are no or low connection to organizational priorities in most organizations that manage facilities. It's hard for them to demonstrate an ROI. They don't want to demonstrate an ROI. Most of the fanciest buildings that are built, they're built, they're christened, and then it takes like 2 years for them to actually achieve the performance that they said they were going to achieve. There's a giant industry called retro-commissioning around this. This is not a scandal. It's fine. You got to tune things up, but it's never quite as fast as they're telling you in the public to get a building to perform just right, and sometimes you don't. And there's a bunch of black box processes with your suppliers. After you had a business process, you'd have more of a unified command, integration of energy with core business goals, ability to clarify and incentivize your employees on key performance indices, and you'd be on more equal footing with your energy service providers. The managers of the facilities would really know what was going on and be able to negotiate fully. And I think there's a lot, for example, really interesting, there's a lot of work now in smart grid analytics for utilities, and I think there's an emerging field that's going to be for smart grid analytics for consumers. The smart big companies will actually use smart grid information to negotiate better prices and better deals and things like that. For a chief marketing officer, how does it change, for example? Today, most sustainability marketing efforts are one-off. There is no connection really to their own performance based on what their sustainability performance is as a company. And there are lots of diverse standards and marketing targets, right? Millions of eco-labels. And afterwards, you could be much more programmatic. You'd be much clearer about which attributes of sustainability were valuable to your brand and to your company. And you'd be able to target your messaging much better to key constituencies. So this is sort of how the behavior of actors might change were there, in fact, to be a real business process in place. Okay, so, you know, I've been doing this for 6 years. Say what? Okay, yeah, I'm almost done. I've been at this for 6 years, and I'm incredible. I mean, the good news is there's an incredible amount of people in the business sector, tens of thousands of very talented people who are really committed to making this change happen. And they're looking for answers from people like us, from policymakers, from within themselves. They're generating answers. So there's incredible momentum of do-gooding in the business sector, and people really desperate to find answers to these problems and innovate. There's also incredible change happening. There is incredible dematerialization underway. 3 companies I sold to, for example, HP. There's almost no question today that we can feed the growing demand for information with 0 net carbon footprint increase forever. All right? This is a function of the fact that energy, data processing and and information transmission is getting exponentially more efficient. There's a 10-fold increase in the efficiency of data processing every 6 years. Kumi's law, friend of mine, classmate of mine from Berkeley. Second of all, there is also obviously exponentially increasing demand for information, but that demand is going to increasingly smaller and smaller devices, which means we're not pumping out infinitely more information to HDTVs, we're pumping it out to devices that are naturally limited by battery life, et cetera. And that there's no question that the improvements in data processing are outstripping the rate at which data is being consumed and will likely to be. Now, if you're in the business of selling data to HDTVs, you're not going to be in that position. But as an industry as a whole, and a person like HP that builds data farms could make this claim today, that we're going to power the world's information demand with no net increase in carbon footprint today. Second of all, well, the end user devices, I'm sorry, the rest of the slide actually makes the point. The end user devices are becoming smaller. And finally, we're changing the way things like shopping and news and information consumption are happening that are dematerializing in and of themselves, right? People like eBay are making secondary markets available for more efficient use of products. We're eliminating print in many ways, whether that's driving down, depending on the sector, that's driving down overall energy consumption. So there's incredibly hopeful stuff happening where there's, in fact, a radically smaller footprint because of technology change. But on the other hand, the leverage points, I think, remain policy. I think we have to have prices on this stuff that actually drive the innovation much more rapidly than we're doing it otherwise. We cannot give up on it. As much as we need a business sector, it can't happen just indigenously because of innovation, because of how far behind we are compared to things like supply chain or finance in terms of business understanding of energy as part of business processes. Kumi's law is the one I mentioned earlier about the rapidly increasing rate of efficiency of data processing. And then I would point finally to big disruptions that are possible. I think one of the areas that we're missing in the transportation policy sector is a real understanding of how disruptively we could change transportation very quickly with things like an iPhone. I'm an advisor to a company called GetAround, which is car sharing, not just Zipcar, but actually you can share your car with somebody else. And the reality is their mission, they understand their mission to be virtualizing, to be moving from car ownership to car transportation services, and eventually having a suite of services that go from sharing a car to automatic taxi dispatching so that you leave your house, you look at your phone, you jump in a car because a friend is going a certain distance, you get onto a train that's going at exactly the right time, and take a bike or rent somebody else's car at your endpoint to get to where you need to go. And that we could create a seamless web. I think policymakers are way behind on this one. It's much cheaper than transportation reauthorization and radically, and could be a radical game changer. So I'm going to stop with that. I started by saying I wish I had found that, yeah, we just need to transform business and it's all ready to go. There are really thick behavioral obstacles to the deep and rapid change that we need to have happen in the business sector. I hope I've explained some of them in a way that you guys might be inspired to find answers faster than we're doing it right now.